In 2004, the New York Times wrote that Vogue was in crisis. The paper described an environment of, quote, anxiety, anger, and fear, and the people whose stories they retelling. Second, I am shocked. It is rare to read a book about a subject that you know nothing about and come away from it feeling like you know that subject inside and out. We see them rise and fall, succeed and fail. By the time Sissy Spacek took over as CEO of the company in 1980, it was on the brink of bankruptcy. Within a decade, though, she turned the company around, expanded its reach, cut costs, and boosted profits. This influence extended beyond the fashion world. At parties, fundraisers, and galas, Vogue became the arbiter of taste, determining who was in and who was out. She became the public face of the company and magazines as a whole. She courted celebrities, cozied up to politicians, and made a personal fortune. But behind the scenes, she was losing control of Vogue. By the 2000s, Condé Nast was experiencing growing pains. Its magazines were successful, but they weren't turning a profit. They churned out articles that reinforced the values and tastes of their affluent audience. And that meant that they largely ignored or outright opposed the political and economic changes happening in the country. Condé Nast's strategy was simple. If you're rich, we will tell you how to spend your money. And if you're not rich, we won't talk about politics because that might make some of our advertisers uncomfortable. And that meant that the holding company that owned Condé Nast was losing interest. People like Andre Leon Talley, who believed that magazines should do more than just cater to the whims of the elite. Both books together will give you a really solid understanding of how the fashion industry works and how it shapes our lives. By the 2010s, the future of magazines was looking bleak. The internet was taking over and young readers were spending less and less time with print. The pandemic only accelerated this trend. By 2021, magazines were relics of the past. And yet, Condé Nast somehow managed to navigate this shift successfully. Today, it remains a cultural powerhouse. It has diversified its platforms and found new ways to monetize its content. And it continues to shape the way that Americans think about style, taste, and culture. In 2004, it put the company up for sale. And a year later, it sold it to a private equity firm called Forstmann Little. And by extension, Wintour became one of the most powerful women in America. If you enjoyed it, please leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps other people find us more easily. You can also email us at the address provided below. Thanks for listening and see you next time. Condé Nast's strategy was successful, but it came at a cost. Now, though, she introduces a fourth, the writer Andre Leon Talley, who serves as a kind of Greek chorus throughout the book. He joins Vogue in 1988 and becomes close friends with Anna Wintour. But over time, he becomes disillusioned by what he sees happening, both at Vogue and in the world more broadly. As Condé Nast consolidates power and wealth, he grows increasingly critical of the company and the industry as a whole. While the company raked in billions of dollars, the magazines themselves became hollowed-out shells of their former selves. Their pages became thinner and thinner and filled with fewer and fewer articles, and the staff shrank as well. Magazines once boasted hundreds of employees. By the late 1990s, however, Vogue had fewer than 100. Her approach to management was brutal, and she was known for firing people in particularly cruel ways. But it worked. And by the late 1980s, she had not only saved the company, but set it up for incredible growth, but not for the reasons you might expect. See, the problem wasn't that Vogue's sales were declining or that its ad revenue was falling. In fact, neither of those things was true. Vogue was selling more copies and making more money than it ever had before. The problem was that those profits weren't trickling down. And as a result, Condé Nast was threatening to walk so that Vogue could run. This growth would eventually take the form of several highly successful magazines, including the relaunch of Vogue, as well as the launches of GQ, Wired, The New Yorker, Bon Appetit. In each case, the formula was the same. Find a struggling or dying magazine, gut the staff, slash the budget, focus on a wealthy elite audience, and turn it into a moneymaker. Condé Nast didn't just find success with this approach. They defined the modern age of American magazines. And we watch as they change not only the culture of Condé Nast, but also the culture of America. If you think that sounds dramatic, then trust me when I say that it is warranted. One of my favorite things about this book is that Neverola doesn't shy away from making an argument. This is not a neutral history of Condé Nast. Instead, Neverola tells the story of Condé Nast through the lens of inequality. And it is clear that she believes that what happened at Condé Nast is a microcosm of what happened in America more broadly. But by the end of this book, I felt like I knew everything there was to know about fashion magazines. Third, and maybe this goes without saying, but I am angry. Not only at some of the awful behavior detailed in these pages, up until the 1980s, fashion magazines had been decidedly mid-century. They had broad appeal, covered a range of topics, and relied on advertising revenue from across the economy. But by the late 1980s, thanks in part to the emergence of cable television, readers had more options than ever before, and advertisers had more places to put their dollars. As a result, magazines were struggling. Condé Nast identified an opportunity and decided to lean into it. With Anna Wintour at the helm, the company poured resources into Vogue, turning it into the Bible of American style. And unlike previous editors-in-chief who had dressed in practical clothing and worn little makeup, Wintour showed up to work wearing designer clothes and no stockings, setting the tone for the rest of the industry, but also at myself for not seeing the connection between glossy magazines and the cultivation of inequality. Long before this book reads like a thriller, and not just because of its explosive revelations, but also because of how surprising it is. The book isn't about politics or corporate espionage, or even business. It's about the publishing industry, specifically one company, Nast. It's probably no surprise that I had never heard of Condé Nast before reading this book. But after reading it, I have many thoughts. And it is hard to imagine what could have precipitated such a dark moment for a publication that has spent the last few decades defining American style. But we now know exactly what was happening at Vogue in 2004. The company used the magazine as an accelerant to growing and entrenching inequality in America. What started with Vogue soon spread to other publications like GQ, Vanity Fair, Wired, The New Yorker, and Bon Appetit. To tell the story, Nivarella follows three main characters. The first is Anna Wintour, who became editor-in-chief of Vogue in 1988 and who still holds the position today. Up until recently, she was a near mythical figure whose face rarely appeared in public and who is said to wield extraordinary power within the company and the fashion industry at large. Next is Sissy Spacek, a member of the founding family of Condé Nast, who served as CEO of the company from 1980 to 2001. She played a key role in expanding the company from a small British publisher to a global media giant, and she did it while smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day, having affairs with her staff, and refusing to hire anyone older than 35. Finally, there's a character named Peter Elliott, who worked at Condé Nast for nearly 30 years. He started as an assistant and rose to become a senior executive at both Condé Nast and Vogue. Over the course of his career, he oversaw hundreds of layoffs, which made him very wealthy but also deeply unhappy. Because this month, a new book called Empire of the Elite. Inside Nast, the media dynasty that reshaped America, hit shelves. I'm the host of this show, and this is a book review podcast where we talk about the stories that are changing our world. First, I wish there were more journalists like the author Shima, who are you unafraid to dig deep into a subject matter they themselves do you wouldn't necessarily care all that much about, so that the rest of us can learn something new. The basic thesis of the book is that since the early 1980s, when a media dynasty called Nast took over the struggling British edition of Vogue together, these three figures drive the narrative of the book. As she tells it, the story of Condé Nast is one of relentless expansionism. But in order to keep growing, the company needed a new space. And that's when it turned to the fashion industry. By the 1990s, the strategy was paying off. Vogue became the go-to publication for America's elite, and its influence grew accordingly. At the center of all of this was Anna Wintour, who was known for her icy demeanor and ruthless efficiency. This is when the New York Times published that now infamous article about Vogue declaring that it was in crisis. And indeed, it was. Once again, Nivarella brings the focus back to the characters that have driven her narrative thus far. By the 2010s, Condé Nast's magazines had morphed into what Nivarella calls, quote, lifestyle branding machines. While this strategy proved to be lucrative for the company, it left a bitter taste in the mouth of many writers and readers alike. If you like this book, I think you should check out another book called The Business of Fashion, which is a history of the fashion industry from the 19th century to today. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Book Review.